stitches are out, he'll pass for a normal, quite attractive teenager.
I want him to know and feel pain. What I create, I must control. Go on, activate this body.
Whit Bissell, demonic as Professor Frankenstein, who creates out of human parts the most terrifying creature to walk the earth today.
I should destroy you as dangerous evidence.
We're not talking about actors. We mean a real monster.
I brought her back. She'll live and I'll get her another body.
They're gonna kiss me, but don't let anyone see me like that. Please, doctor, help me!
Biologically speaking, it's of primary importance that man should want to mate. Hey, that worked!
You don't get all your kicks from surfing, do you?
We want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
You think you're gonna make a slave of the world? I'll see you in hell first!
The American International Podcast.
Are you ready?
Thanks for joining us as we piece together another episode of the American International Podcast. My name is Jeff Markin.
And I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And today we're looking at I Was a Teenage Frankenstein from 1957.
I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was directed by Herbert L. Strock, written by Aben, Kandel, and Herman Cohen under the pseudonym Kenneth Langtry. It was produced by Herman Cohen for Santa Rosa Productions. Executive producers are, of course, Samuel Z. Arkoff and James H. Nicholson.
I Was a Teenage Frankenstein stars Whit Bissell as Professor Frankenstein, Phyllis Coates as Margaret, Robert Burton as Dr. Karlton, Gary Conway as the Teenage Frankenstein monster / Bob, George Lynn as Sergeant Burns, John Cliff as Sergeant McAfee, Marshall Bradford as Dr. Randolph, Joyce Stoner as Arlene, Claudia Bryar as Arlene's mother, Angela Blake as Beautiful Girl, and Russ Whiteman as Dr. Elwood.
I Was a Teenage Frankenstein opens with credits over some discordant piano music, and our first scene takes place inside a medical college of some kind, where Dr. Frankenstein, yes, that's his real name, is lecturing about eye and other organ transplants.
The doctors in attendance of this conference are skeptical. This idea of reanimating dead tissue is preposterous.
Dr. Frankenstein says to go ahead and cling to your skepticism, that one day he will prove them all wrong.
Nobody makes the link that this is a Frankenstein thing. It will be established that Professor Frankenstein's ancestor was Baron Frankenstein and...
Therefore fictional?
Well, no, let's say for the sake of the movie that it's historical fact. He has a reputation for reanimating dead tissue.
Maybe they figure that that's just a story, that never really happened.
But here, Professor Frankenstein is introducing similar ideas, and nobody's even seems affected that his name is Frankenstein.
I know, every time someone says that, I just want to say, yes, that's his real name.
Nobody bats an eye.
Nope.
So later on, at Professor Frankenstein's home laboratory, Dr. Karlton is working with the professor.
Dr. Karlton was at that lecture and tried to defend him to the other doctors.
And he's still stewing about the whole thing. He asked the professor if he's upset about the other doctors' reactions, but the professor says that he's grateful. It put a lot of things in perspective for him.
And it's going to spur him into action, as we'll see.
Then he shares his plans with Karlton. He's going to build a new person using different body parts. Karlton isn't sure he understands, but he should because, as I said, this is right out of the Frankenstein playbook.
Well, he does ask, like, a leg from one person and a hand from another. And Dr. Frankenstein's basically like, yeah, why not? It's like selective breeding, but one step higher. He says that if you breed morons, you get morons. But when intelligent people mate, you get Dr. Frankenstein, I guess.
So Dr. Karlton assumes that this is all going to be done under the supervision of a medical institution.
Nope.
And Professor Frankenstein says, oh no, I'm going to do this right here in my home laboratory. And I think it's ridiculous that Karlton would even think that anybody would sponsor this activity.
Given the reception that his ideas had before, and they didn't even know the full scope of the plans. Dr. Frankenstein says that someone also challenged his great ancestor, Baron Frankenstein, but where the Baron made a monster, the professor is going to make a human being, able to walk among people undetected.
The professor is going to require an assistant for his work, and Dr. Karlton will do nicely. He says that Karlton can handle the electronic aspects of the experiment, and the professor will handle the surgical aspects. In his plan, he will use youthful parts, not old, worn-out body parts.
He wants to make a youth that he can instruct and control. And by doing that, he will prove that only in youth is there any salvation for the hope of mankind. And then as luck would have it, at that moment, there's a car crash right outside their house.
So Professor Frankenstein and Dr. Karlton run outside to see what the commotion was. They find that the car is in flames, but Whit just runs up to them and immediately starts describing what he saw.
Yeah, it's 6 seconds earlier. He's already got the full scope of what happened. It was 2 cars, one hit the other head on, apparently, and somehow it was teenagers coming back from the same party, according to our witness. He says that one was thrown clear of the crash and that he's over there somewhere.
Head-on collision. What a crash. I was right behind him. Jammed my brakes on as fast as I could. Seems to me I saw one kid thrown clear in the air. Over there somewhere.
I'll call the police.
Did you go over to him?
Oh, not me. I can't look at that sort of thing. That kid would bleed to death before the police get here. I think he's had it.
So without checking him, he knows, without knowing, that this teenager's probably lost a lot of blood and there's no point looking at him.
So the next thing we see, Professor Frankenstein and Dr. Karlton are lugging a body over their shoulders back to the laboratory.
They snatch that body.
And as they're doing this, we hear the sound of a police siren outside. Or
an ambulance, or both. Yes, Dr. Karlton is doing the dirty work here. He's carrying the body down to the lab, so we can't see the extent of the damage to the body yet. Dr. Karlton wants to know how Professor Frankenstein thinks he's going to get away with stealing a body from a crash scene.
It is the professor's belief that no one will be able to tell the difference. I guess that's as long as the witness doesn't say anything about the body that he saw being thrown from a vehicle.
And subsequently walked away in full view of everyone assembled there.
So they lay this body onto a gurney. Karlton comments on the temperature in the room. It's pretty cold.
Yeah, it's 36 degrees, the perfect temperature for unembalmed bodies.
The professor says that this is his own private morgue. Karlton looks around and only then notices the body-sized drawers built into the wall.
Yeah, there's a series of drawers there.
The professor asks Karlton of the patient's condition. Karlton says he's dead.
He peels back the cloth covering him. He wrinkles his nose up at the sight of it. And yeah, he just says dead. And Dr. Frankenstein snaps at him. I know that. Like, duh. He's asking about the condition of the corpse. Then he says in his lab, there's no death until I declare it so. Dr. Karlton says that the head is crushed. There's possible brain injury and facial deformity.
The professor takes a look and says, I've seen worse. He says he can easily replace the face. What's important is that the brain is uninjured. But Dr. Karlton just said that it was possibly injured, so...
Well, what does he know? He's not a medical doctor.
So they place the body into one of the drawers. Karlton notes that they're going to need some equipment, and Frankenstein says he's way ahead of him. He's been purchasing equipment every time he's been invited to speak on his lecture circuit.
If every new city, he gets 1 or 2 new items.
Dr. Karlton tries to back out. He says he doesn't have the stomach for this, and maybe the professor should find another assistant. But the professor reminds him of an experiment he assisted on a few months ago, something that made him more than an assistant.
Now he's an accomplice.
Karlton said he thought it was for a book that the professor was working on, and the professor tells him that, well, now he knows better.
Yes, he didn't know the full scope of the evil plans, but whatever he did seems like it was pretty shady. We don't know what it is, and we never will, but he probably should have got out when he had the chance. Frankenstein says that he needs a synchron device with 100,000 volts and high-velocity X-rays with 2-inch penetration and a bunch of other medical mumbo-jumbo, but the parts are all here. Frankenstein says if Dr. Karlton does as asked, he will participate in the greatest experiment ever made.
But that's enough of that for now. It's time to change for the party.
Yeah, it's a goodbye party for Frankenstein. His American visa is up and he has to return to England. He's really enjoyed his time here, though, he tells the assembled guests.
At the party, someone proposes a toast to Professor Frankenstein and says that his lectures will be missed. I'm not sure why, because no one seems to take his lectures seriously. But maybe it's a source of amusement for them.
Maybe. Or maybe he saves the crazy stuff for when he's not teaching students. There is one woman at the party who is not too happy to be saying goodbye to him. She mopes in an alcove when everyone else is toasting the doctor. Frankenstein sees this and goes over to her. He asks her why she didn't join in the toast.
This is Margaret, and she says that she wasn't anxious to say goodbye. She was his nurse and a good friend, and she implies that she would have liked to have become more.
She does more than apply it. She actually says that being a friend is not enough. And then she asks if she's being too bold. Frankenstein doesn't think so. And he says it's the nature of the female to pursue the male. In what species, I guess?
Well, he says that science has conclusively proven this.
I think there's a little more nuance to it than that.
Margaret asks Frankenstein if he likes being pursued, and he says only when he's being caught.
Frankenstein asks Margaret to assist him with the experiment that he'll be working on in the 2 months before his departure. If it's successful, then they can be together in England. She'll be working as his assistant full-time, so she'll have to give up her nursing post at the hospital. But Dr. Frankenstein has an answer for that, too.
Then, when his experiment is over, they can go back to England together. And the Queen Mary is an ideal place for a honeymoon. So, congratulations, I guess they're engaged.
He says all that, and then he says, if you'll have me. And she says, oh, darling, of course. And they kiss. So, yeah, pretty simple engagement. No frills, as you'd expect with a Dr. Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein wants Margaret to work for him, keeping all disturbing factors away from him. That includes mail, telephone calls, guests, requests for interviews and articles. He only wants to see Dr. Karlton while he's working.
And he says, oh, and Margaret too, of course.
She promises to be the best watchdog that he ever had. And she realizes that she will have to give up her room at the hospital.
So Professor Frankenstein says she can move into his house. There's a room there she can have, and Mrs. Dietrich, the housekeeper, can be the chaperone, should they require one.
Now Frankenstein and Dr. Karlton are working on their cadaver. The hand and the leg of this body were crushed and will have to be removed. He says the leg will have to be removed below the patella, but we'll find out later that there was a bit more damage than that. Frankenstein wants Karlton to apply the cathodes, and Karlton says why. He can't feel pain, but Frankenstein wants him to feel pain, so he'll be grateful to the doctor for the absence of it. Frankenstein also said that what he creates, he must control.
Professor Frankenstein then instructs Dr. Karlton to activate the body. Karlton goes over to the controls and says he'll start with 50,000 volts. He pushes some buttons and sparks start flying around this body. Upstairs, Margaret is dutifully answering the phone. Professor Frankenstein's residence. I'm terribly sorry, he's seeing no one.
She's doing a great job of gatekeeping. Back in the lab, Frankenstein is sawing off the leg. We hear the saw going through bone, pretty gory sounding, but there's nothing to see until Frankenstein lifts the entire leg, not just below the patella, up to camera.
He says he'll perform a transfusion later.
And he'll select the blood himself.
A woozy Karlton asks what he's going to do with all these discarded body parts, and the professor has a contingency for that as well.
Oh, you won't believe this.
He leads Karlton over to a chute that leads down to an alligator pit where he can dispose of all unneeded body parts and tissues.
This chute is hidden behind a secret panel on the wall, which he opens whenever he has stuff to get rid of. So he drops the leg down and feeds the gator. And then Professor Frankenstein says, now I have to get 2 hands and a right leg. And they leave the lab. I guess the other hand was damaged too, but he never said that.
The next morning, reading the paper, we see the headline, Mass Funeral for Teenage Victims. These were the victims of a plane crash 2 days ago, and an entire track team was killed. Dr. Frankenstein says, tragic, all those fine, young, athletic bodies. All those hours of training for strength, speed, and endurance gone to waste.
However, he's not going to let all of that go to waste. He knows the bodies are going to be interred at a cemetery that afternoon, as per the headline, so he's planning to go there to pay his respects, so to speak.
So we cut to Professor Frankenstein and Dr. Karlton visiting the morgue, taking only what they need, each carrying a bundle, which we presume hold 2 hands and a right leg between them.
They put them in the trunk and speed off home, or they can be caught. Although if it's happening that afternoon, this isn't like an early morning heist. This must have happened in the middle of the day. They got the news on the morning paper, and the news said that they were going to be interred that afternoon. That didn't give them very much time, and I would assume not very much privacy, but we just are going to wave that away like many other aspects of this movie.
So back down in the laboratory, the surgery for the reattachment of limbs and transfusion is going on.
Yeah, Frankenstein is praising his own fine surgical technique, if he must say so himself. He's attaching the purloined parts to his experimental body. He says the hands came from a champion wrestler and the leg from a football player, although in the newspaper article, it said it was a track team that had been killed in the plane crash.
Well, I guess going to the morgue, maybe it's kind of like a grocery store and you just pick whatever you want.
Yeah, there's all kinds of dead athletes.
There was other options.
Professor Frankenstein says that the reattached bones should knit together in a day or 2, thanks to the heated fluids and vital rays that he's pumping into the body.
Dr. Karlton states that what is impossible for others is a daily event for you. And Frankenstein says that he's delighted to have impressed Dr. Karlton.
Now it's dinner time. Everyone is in the dining room eating. Professor Frankenstein compliments the roast, but Margaret's pouting and pushing her food around on the plate. She says that she doesn't enjoy food like he does. Frankenstein gets ready to retire to his study, but Margaret is still frowning. She's tired of spending every day and night alone. It's not much fun for her.
Professor Frankenstein apologizes for being neglectful, and so he agrees to an evening of driving and conversation.
Just what she wanted. She wants to relax and make plans.
So they're in the car, and Margaret directs him to a makeout spot. The professor finds this intriguing and notes that as adults, they're lucky to have found a parking spot. Margaret suggests they turn off the radio and do what the teenagers do. They tell her it's loads of fun. Fortunately, the scene fades to black before we have to watch the two of them swap spit.
Mercifully. But I do think Professor Frankenstein gets some important idea by ending up at this location. Now we're back in the lab where Dr. Karlton and Professor Frankenstein are regarding the body. It's now fully dressed, though the head is still fully wrapped in bandages.
The professor bids his creation good morning, but gets no response. Then the professor remarks that he knows he can speak because he sewed in the tongue himself.
Pretty funny line, actually.
And then there's I think we should say here that we compared two different cuts of this film. The American AIP version and the British Anglo-amalgamated cut that was released on VHS domestically in the 90s. And there is an insert here that does not appear on the British version. We compare the two versions, the US AIP version and the British Anglo-amalgamated cut. The British cut was released on VHS domestically in the US in the 90s, and this brief sequence appears in the American version and therefore not in the licensed release VHS version. So when the creation refuses to speak, the professor asks Dr. Karlton to give it a few jolts. So a few buttons are pushed again, and the body on the table jumps a little bit and reacts. And then both cuts of the film start matching again.
Dr. Karlton thinks maybe it's too early for the body to start talking, but Professor Frankenstein insists that with his surgical skill and the vital rays that he's been giving the body, and of course, a little torture, that by now this creation should be chattering away like a congressman at a filibuster. Frankenstein says that he's healed up, his brain is intact, and he has one good eye, so he should be able to watch his lips as he repeats good morning.
So once again, the professor says good morning, and this time the once dead teenager replies, good morning. The professor turns to Dr. Karlton and says, you see, persistence has its rewards.
As does torture. Professor Frankenstein says that he'll be chattering like a magpie soon. Now, Dr. Karlton, can you accuse me of being cruel? Asked Professor Frankenstein, just before ordering his assistant to put the body back in the drawer of the morgue. Now that he's fully awake, but his creation has a little bit more to say.
The professor appreciates this kind of initiative and encourages him to speak up. He says, it's dark in here. And the professor basically says, yes, suck it up, get used to it.
Yeah, but you can't accuse him of being cruel.
At this, the monster starts to cry. The professor thinks this is pretty cool.
Yeah, even the tear ducts work.
He's such an awesome scientist.
And he says, it seems we have a very sensitive teenager on our hands.
I'm going to note that that is in the British cut and not in the AIP cut. That line about the sensitive teenager.
Yeah, I don't know why they would have cut that. It just makes him look like more of a jerk, really.
So later on, Professor Frankenstein is in his study, and there's a knock on the door. He says, come in, and the voice on the other end says, I can't, the door's locked. It's Margaret.
Professor Frankenstein reminds Margaret that he didn't want to be disturbed, but she wants to talk. She's making plans for the most important event of her life. That's her wedding, of course. She wants her fiancé's input, but Frankenstein's not interested in that because the most important event in his life is this experiment.
Yes, this experiment must take precedence over everything. Margaret asks about the experiment, and the professor tells her that it's need to know.
And she doesn't need to know. At least not yet. He'll tell her when it's successful.
So she says if he won't tell her, she'll just have to figure it out for herself, and this stops him in his tracks.
He gets explosively angry here.
He turns around and says, what do you mean by that?
Well, she says she has her ways, and he says, what ways? Tell me, answer me.
And when she won't elaborate, he slaps her.
She's hurt in more than one way. She says she had no intention of spying on him. It was just something that she said, and he's pleased by that. And then he gives her a non-apology by saying that you understand a scientist's devotion to duty, and it'll soon be done.
Once this experiment is over, they can be married, and they will start their new life together. And she promises she won't bother him again and goes to leave.
He tells her to dry her tears, and she says that she'll never disturb him again, kind of sarcastically, I think. And then Professor Frankenstein mentions that he and Dr. Karlton are about to leave to go get some supplies. And Margaret sarcastically says that she'll go back to her kennel and be the best watchdog you ever had. Then she leaves.
So as Professor Frankenstein and Dr. Karlton leave, Margaret watches them drive off from a window. Then she immediately heads downstairs to the laboratory.
Yep, it's girl detective time. She takes her purse down to the laboratory door and puts a little putty in the keyhole. From that, I guess she gets an impression. I don't really think that's possible, given the way the lock is situated.
She takes this impression to a locksmith, and this amazing key grinder is somehow able to make a working key from this.
Yes, he thinks it's for her old-fashioned trunk, but obviously we know better.
Now, even if this were possible, I would think that it would be quite a liability for a locksmith to make a key from the impression of a lock and not the key itself.
Yeah, that could be the door to a bank vault. It could be somebody's house. Yeah, if anybody found out that that's how you broke into their house, or not even broke in, just walked straight in.
But this key grinder is from the old country, so maybe he doesn't think about these things.
Maybe not. He bought her line about it being key to a trunk. But we'll forget about all that. Margaret goes back to the lab, and her new key successfully unlocks the door. She walks in. She doesn't see anything at first. We hear some electronic devices zapping, but then she sees the drawers in the morgue.
She tries to open a few of the cadaver drawers, and most of them are locked. One isn't, so she pulls that one open, and that happens to be the one containing, I assume, the titular character of the film.
The Teenage Frankenstein? Yes, it's the creation. It sits up, gives her a look, and then lies back down. She screams, closes the drawer, and runs away.
Later on, Professor Frankenstein is working with the creation's speech.
He's moved the body from the morgue drawer to a bed. He's giving his creature language and etiquette lessons, demanding that his experiment call him sir, like they do in England, where they have more respect for their elders.
Professor asks the creation to repeat the phrase, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." The creation repeats the phrase nearly perfectly. He's got a little bit of a lisp, but the professor is pleased nonetheless. And at this point, there's another quick sequence cut from the British version, where the professor asks the creation if he knows where this passage comes from.
He successfully pegs it as a Bible verse. When asked, what else do we call the Bible? He says it's the good book.
It is the law we live by.
But that was cut from the English version. I guess they weren't too keen on that part. Now that he's completed these mental exercises, Frankenstein wants his creation to work on his physical being. He's going to be working out his hands and his new leg.
Professor asks him to clench and unclench his hands, and then tells him he must do this 100 times in each hand to raise his strength. But only the professor can tell him to whom he can raise his fists.
And his creation says that he will obey.
So now he's going to leave the creation with Dr. Karlton and an exercise regimen.
He's going to get him some supplemental nutrition and exercise equipment. So after doing that, Frankenstein peeks in on his creation and sees him doing some shirtless weightlifting, and he looks on in homoerotic approval.
The professor is very pleased with himself and his creation.
He's always pleased with himself. That's not new news. Frankenstein tells his experiment that his remarkable physical and mental progress and his obedience are making him very happy.
The creation, however, is not happy. He's pretty lonely. He wants to see other people.
I like your line about wanting to see other people.
That's exactly what he said.
He wants to walk among people, is what he said. Professor Frankenstein asked him to stop badgering him. He'll tell him when he can be around other people. The creation doesn't accept this. So Frankenstein says, "I'll show you why you have to stay here." And then he cuts off his head bandages to show the teen his messed up face.
He's pretty hideous.
It is pretty bad.
His right eye is bulging out. His hair is matted and kind of receding.
He's covered in paste and paper mache and other icky things.
And it's a black and white film, but we are led to believe that his face is green.
Well, from the gangrene, I guess. Decomposition. Frankenstein says, "You'll be glad to stay here till I make you fit to go among people."
So the professor leaves him alone to contemplate his lack of beauty. But as the professor storms out, he neglects to shut the door.
Kind of a big oversight on his part for someone who's so careful and into his privacy.
So the creation ventures out into the world for the first time.
He goes upstairs and then into the living room. He sits on an armchair and plucks a flower from a vase. The flower's no use to him, so he drops it on the piano, which is also in the room. He sits down to play, but his first note scares him, and he leaves the room.
So he's made his way outside. He's walking along the sidewalk, and he seems to be causing traffic problems. There's lots of horns honking and brakes screeching.
He goes down an alley and finds himself outside a window. Looking inside, we see a beautiful woman brushing her hair. She sees him in her mirror, and she screams.
Instead of fleeing, the creature seems to think that he needs to make this woman shut up. So he breaks the window and kicks through the half-inch wall.
Busts in like the Kool-Aid man.
He goes to her and covers her mouth to stop the horrible noise she's making, and she falls onto a chair.
In another deleted scene, we see that after she faints, he goes through the motions of strangling her. We don't see that, but we see him, and we hear him choking the life out of her. That was cut from the English version, though.
Yeah, it's just an insert shot that it was cut from the British version.
But the scene makes a lot more sense when you see it. We didn't see it the first time around, and it didn't seem like he did too much, and all of a sudden she's dead because he covered her mouth with his hand.
So after that insert shot, both cuts of the film match again. This girl is apparently dead. The creation goes out into the hall, and there are a few people out there, and they panic and grab each other when they see him.
Instead of going out into the alley through the hole he made in the wall, he decides he needs more witnesses. He goes through the hallway. There are people who heard the screams, I guess. Just sort of pushes his way through them. He doesn't harm anybody else. They look pretty alarmed.
So where are they? My first impression was it was a dormitory of some sort.
But it seems to be an apartment because there's all kinds of different ages of people there out in the hallway. There's an older couple. There's a middle-aged couple.
But the hallway door leads to this girl's bedroom.
Yeah, it's really weird. Not a lot of thought went to the setup for this movie.
So now there are a group of adults who aren't the people that we saw in the hallway, giving their descriptions of the assailant to a couple of police investigators.
They can't agree on his height. One says that the creature was 7 feet tall, but everyone can agree that his face was like a mask, such as those used by robbers.
I couldn't believe my eyes. He was nearly 7 foot tall.
No, he was shorter, but built solid. Broad shoulders, heavy arms.
His face, what there was of it, 'twas terrible, terrible.
If you ask me, he wore a mask, like those guys who hold up supermarkets.
Well, one thing for sure, he was strong. He hit me like I was a baby. I've never been hit so hard.
The investigators take note of all these discrepancies and tell everyone to go on home, but be sure to lock their doors and windows.
Right, because he can't kick in through the wall.
Well, if they're all built like that one, it's not going to be an issue.
They're perfectly safe. They're also looking for him. They've blocked the streets off. He feels like he'll be captured pretty soon. The next day, Professor Frankenstein is having his breakfast. Looking at the morning paper, the headline reads, "Crazed Man Kills Young Woman." This causes the professor to go downstairs, where he figures out that the door had been open all this time.
So back in the laboratory, he finds his creation moping. "So it was you," he says.
The creation says, "I just wanted to go out."
He said he just wanted to see people, but they all ran from him.
Just as the professor predicted.
But he also says he didn't mean to hurt anyone.
Frankenstein is very angry that he killed that woman, not because he killed a woman, but because it means that the police will be looking for him.
The professor tells him that he warned him that something like this would happen, and it may be too late to fix what has been done, but if the creation will stay quiet and hide in the basement, he may be able to protect him until the whole thing blows over.
And the creation does promise to obey the doctor, who says that we must keep you silent.
So the professor heads back upstairs, leaving the creation alone to think about what he has done.
I have the exact same line. Professor Frankenstein hears the doorbell ring. Of course, it's the police. Police are going door to door to find out if anybody knows anything about the fiend prowling through the neighborhood.
The professor introduces himself as Professor Frankenstein, and again, no one bats an eye at this. And the professor says he hasn't seen anything, but he does ask for a description of this so-called fiend so that he may keep a lookout.
The police say that 6 different people gave 6 different descriptions, but they all agree that his face would scare a ghost. And Dr. Frankenstein seems kind of tickled by this detail.
Yeah, that's something the professor says he will keep in mind.
He says he'll let the police know if he sees or hears anything so he can close the door on them.
So next we see that Margaret has invited a jeweler to the house to show his wares of engagement rings and wedding bands.
Yeah, I guess she has to pick out her own ring, since her super romantic fiancé is not going to do it.
Professor Frankenstein is alarmed to find a stranger in his house.
In his office, no less.
The jeweler is very happy to be there, though. And he tells Professor Frankenstein that a beautiful fiancé deserves a beautiful engagement ring. Frankenstein, however, seems to disagree with this.
Margaret also says that with the big day coming up, it's time to pick out the engagement ring. She wanted his help, but the professor just yells at the jeweler to get out. After the merchant leaves, Frankenstein turns to Margaret and says, "I suppose to make me feel guilty, you're going to burst into tears." But Margaret is too furious to cry. She thought the great scientist would be able to spare a few moments for his fiancée.
But Frankenstein says that she knows that he doesn't allow strangers in his house. And she asks why. Is he hiding something? A look of concern passes over Frankenstein's face. What makes you say that?
And Margaret does the classic giving things away too soon. She says, "I know you are hiding something." She confesses that she's seen his monster in the lab. He demands to know how she got in there. She says that she took an impression of the lock and had a key made. But rather than explode, Frankenstein praises her for her resourcefulness.
She goes on to say that as a future mate, she believed that he wouldn't just want someone who would just blindly obey him, because apparently she doesn't know him at all.
She says that she should know what he's striving for. It'll help her understand him better and to love him better.
And despite everything that's happened, she does still love him. And he says that he doesn't need to tell her how he feels about her.
He kind of softens here, and he does tell her that he trusts her more than anyone in the world, and that he would have told her everything eventually. He thinks it's good that she snooped, that his monster brought them closer together. And then he gives her a blank check and tells her to go buy the diamond ring set that she liked the most. He wants to see her wearing it at dinner time. He's not going to put it on her finger himself. Just let her do all the work.
As she starts off, she turns and asks if he wants the key that she had made, and he tells her to keep it as a symbol of his trust in her.
I guess she loves him too much to be suspicious of this total change in attitude, and she takes off to buy her ring.
So the professor goes back down to the moping creation. The professor tells him that the storm has blown over, and in another few days, the police will have new crimes to think about. But the creation is still brooding.
He wants to be able to go out, and he wants a new face. Professor Frankenstein says he would get him a new face, but there's one problem. A woman who works for him is going to tell the police. Professor Frankenstein will go to jail. His creation will be captured and destroyed unless we stop her, he says.
We must stop her, says the creation. And the creation says he will do exactly as he's told.
We're back up in the study where Professor Frankenstein asks for Margaret's help in the lab. They banter a bit about her ring. Margaret loves it.
She says it's the first thing she looks at in the morning and the last thing she sees at night. So this might be at least a day later.
Probably. He bided his time for a whole day.
And she says that it's made her very happy.
And she wants to know how she can pay for the ring. He's not sure what she means, but what she does mean is that how can she help him with his experiment?
The professor explains that Dr. Karlton has gone out on another equipment run and is expected to be gone 2 or 3 days. She says she won't miss him, but the professor will, as his assistant, of course.
Right, because now it's time to feed the young man, and he wants Margaret to do the honors. He makes sure that she's not afraid. Frankenstein tells Margaret that the creation is as gentle as a baby at feeding time, and he takes her down to the lab, making her open the door with her own key.
So the professor, without even introducing the two of them, because I guess they already met.
They did.
Unofficially.
No names were exchanged, but he has no name.
The professor has Margaret inject the creation with its nutrient regimen. She says, I won't hurt you, but he winces at the needle's penetration.
Frankenstein excuses himself. He says he's going upstairs to get some supplementary vitamins. Once he's gone, the creation says, you hurt me. Margaret says, but I fed you. And then the creation says that she wants to hurt him some more. And though Margaret denies that, he lunges for her.
He says, you want to see me killed. And she says, that's not true. She screams, and we go to the other side of the door where Professor Frankenstein is listening to her screams.
You didn't go get those vitamins? She tries to escape, but Frankenstein slams the door shut on her. And through the door, we hear her being strangled by the creation.
So the deed being done, we see that Margaret has been fed to the alligator.
Frankenstein sees the alligator biting down on something and says, poor Margaret.
At this point, there is another brief moment cut from the British version where Professor Frankenstein notes that she really loved her engagement ring. He's holding it. He repeats first thing in the morning, last thing at night. At least I saved the trinket.
He's going to get his money back, that's for sure.
The creation says she can't hurt me anymore. And Frankenstein says, no, she's beyond pain now, giving or receiving. And then both cuts start matching up again.
Frankenstein promises his creation that he will now receive his reward. My new face? Asks the monster. Frankenstein says, yes, we'll go out tonight amongst people, and you can pick out the face you want. He loves promising people a shopping spree, doesn't he?
So now the professor is driving the creation around and they're looking for a face.
The creation's a little afraid of being in a car, And Frankenstein says that's natural. You were killed in a car. But you'll get over it, he promises. And he'll feel better once he has his new face.
Then he goes on to describe just how great he is as a scientist.
He's daydreaming about all the accolades he'll receive when he reveals his creation to his fellow scientists, and they see a dead brain pumped full of knowledge.
Someday, after we have baffled the learned men of science, I'll tell the entire world the truth. How you were reborn. How I fashioned you from different parts, breathed life into you, pumped knowledge and wisdom into a brain that was hidden in a corpse. Then I'll be honored by the entire world, having brought mankind one step further in the eternal battle against death.
So the professor drives the creation to the Lover's Lane where Margaret had taken him earlier.
Not for the same reason, though, I believe.
We don't know that.
Yeah, we don't know that.
So the first car they see, the professor asks the creature if that face would meet his approval. And the creation isn't really picky because any face is better than the one he has now. And as a bonus, this boy's face looks a lot like Gary Conway's, so it's going to be convenient for the film's budget, too.
So once decided, Frankenstein leaves it to the creation to do the dirty work, of course. He goes over to the car. He startles the couple necking inside. The girl screams. The guy starts to look up. I don't think he gets a full look at what's coming in after him as the creation opens up the door and puts his arms on the guy, pulling him out.
Then we dissolve to an additional scene, again excluded from the British cut, where back in the laboratory, Professor Frankenstein and the creation are looking at something covered on a table. The professor removes the covering to reveal the severed head of the boy from Lover's Lane.
In a birdcage.
Then we dissolve back and the cuts once again resume playing in sync. The police investigators are questioning the girl's mother.
Her name is Arlene, not the mom, the girl that was with the boy who was captured. Arlene's mom is telling the police that when the attack happened, Arlene screamed and passed out. When she awoke, she was alone in the car. Somehow she managed to drive herself home. Now she's sedated and she just keeps murmuring Bob.
Bob is obviously the boy who was in the car. Arlene's mother asks if the perpetrator could be the same as that fiend from the other night. The police say it's possible, but it's just as likely it's a prank pulled by some of the other kids.
The cops ask Arlene's mom if she had other boyfriends or if Bob had any enemies. Teenagers have enemies? Arlene's mom says that Bob was Arlene's first boyfriend and they were rock steady, and Bob was a quiet but popular boy. They look at a photo of Bob that Arlene had taken and again say that he's very handsome.
So back down in the laboratory, it appears the facial transplant was successful. The creation is admiring his new face in the mirror.
Which is funny because facial transplant surgery just became a thing like maybe 10 years ago. And it does not look this good. The results are not as fine as Professor Frankenstein's. But he really was onto something.
Dr. Karlton returns from discreetly buying equipment in 4 different cities, and the professor rewards him with sherry.
They're going to toast to the future, I guess. Dr. Karlton asks about the housekeeper. Frankenstein said that she got a better offer, and since he's leaving in 2 days, he let her go, of course. I'm wondering if he really let her go or if the alligator had an extra meal that day. Then Dr. Karlton asks about Margaret, his fiancée.
The professor said that Margaret's gone, left, and he said that she left right after he bought this engagement ring. She didn't go back to the hospital, she just disappeared. But isn't that the way of women?
Yes, Margaret, I guess, had said that the marriage wasn't going to work out. And of course, Frankenstein starts complaining about the perfidy of women. They'll do anything to hurt men, which is rich coming from him.
Making men suffer for their blunders.
I guess he's suffering because he had to kill her, but I doubt it.
So he says that he's been burying himself in his work and, hey, Dr. Karlton, come on down and see the experiment's new face.
Yeah, I thought this was going to go a totally different way. I thought Dr. Karlton was also going to be thrown down the alligator chute.
So Karlton is amazed. He says that once the scar heals, he will pass for a normal, quite attractive teenager.
They're really rubbing in how attractive this kid is, aren't they? Professor Frankenstein says that he plans to launch his creation in England. And Dr. Karlton says, how are you going to do that? He'll need a passport and identification. But Frankenstein says that he's going to disassemble his creation, pack him in several different crates, then reassemble him and reactivate him in England, where he has a lab with the same equipment and he'll have the same assistant. He wants Dr. Karlton to come with him.
Dr. Karlton isn't totally on board with this plan.
He's like, I don't think so.
He says it seems inhumane.
Of course, Frankenstein bulldozes over these concerns and asks Karlton to help him prep the creation for surgery. They're going to tell him it's something to improve his appearance, which of course, in his vanity, he will totally accept.
So they're going to strap him down so that he can't fight back. And under the guise of removing the stitches, Karlton will administer sodium pentothal. So he'll feel nothing as they disassemble him for shipping.
Frankenstein asked Dr. Karlton to inject the creation with sodium pentothal, saying that in 3 days we'll be on the Queen Mary, he promises. Maybe they're going to have a honeymoon. He says, just help me with this. Once the creation is fully strapped down, Frankenstein asks Karlton to inject the sodium pentothal.
The creation, however, does not want this injection and starts to fight back. And though both men try to stop him, they are no match for the creation.
He breaks free of his restraints. Dr. Karlton runs away upstairs.
The creation overpowers Professor Frankenstein and throws him down the shaft to the alligator pit. The alligator roars in approval.
He's really well fed these days.
He roars like a lion.
Karlton returns almost immediately with the police.
As they enter the lab, Dr. Karlton says, I hope we're not too late. When they get inside, one of the police asks, where's Professor Frankenstein? And Karlton says, we're too late.
He knows what's up.
They try to convince the creation to surrender, and Karlton explains that if he goes with them now peacefully, everything will be all right.
That's not going to happen, though. The creation backs into an electrified panel, thus zapping the movie from black and white into color.
Yep, sparks fly colorfully, and the creation is electrocuted. Dr. Karlton checks for a pulse and says that he'll never forget his face after the accident.
And then we see a shot of the former malformed face of the creation blinking slowly.
In color.
And then we fade into a shot of the alligator, who has eaten everything but Professor Frankenstein's lab coat. And then credits roll. The end.
Welcome back to the American International Podcast, where we're discussing I Was a Teenage Frankenstein from 1957.
In May of 1957, Warner Brothers released Hammer Pictures' The Curse of Frankenstein to tremendous success. And 6 months later, AIP's I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was in theaters.
Recently, I Was a Teenage Werewolf had been a big success for AIP, so when R.J. O'Donnell, a Texas theater chain owner, met with Arkoff and Nicholson, he complained about the major studios and the percentages of the take they demanded. He didn't want to pay it, so Nicholson said AIP had I Was a Teenage Frankenstein in production for a January release. O'Donnell requested 2 new horror movies from the studio, saying that if they could be ready by Thanksgiving, he would put them in his flagship theater, the Majestic. Arkoff and Nicholson, who never got their pictures into flagship theaters, were ready to provide them, and thus I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was fast-tracked.
Former AIP executive Milt Moritz told the LA Times that, as was common practice at AIP, he and other executives thought up catchy titles, although Nicholson is the one credited for most of them, including I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, and poster designs. And they sold the chain the double bill of I Was a Teenage Frankenstein and Blood of Dracula, which were then put into production. Moritz said, the 2 pictures together cost $90,000, and we had them in theaters in time for Thanksgiving.
American International Pictures commissioned Herman Cohen to make I Was a Teenage Frankenstein and Blood of Dracula. Cohen said the 2 films were written and put in front of the cameras in only 4 weeks, so he had to really cut down in terms of production values. According to Arkoff's biography, AIP's coup of getting the prime Thanksgiving slot at the Majestic opened doors for us, changing the attitude of many exhibitors who finally realized that AIP was making movies that could earn money for theater owners in their prestige houses. And we had Teenage Frankenstein to thank for that.
The film, intentionally or not, has some of the same elements seen in The Curse of Frankenstein, like close-ups of bloody body parts, although in black and white, not color. And the scene in which Frankenstein's nosy fiancée is killed is very like a similar scene in the Hammer film.
According to the book Rock and Roll Monsters by Bruce G. Hallenbeck, Philip Shear, who had done the makeup and prosthetics for I Was a Teenage Werewolf, also did the mask for the monster in this movie, although the quality wasn't up to the first movie. Too much putty and papier-mâché. This too was a theft, or homage, to Phil Leakey's makeup in Curse. And there was one more nod. The address of Hammer's main office, 113 Wardour Street, is stamped on the side of Professor Frankenstein's crates of lab equipment.
Yeah, I saw that. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was filmed in black and white, with the ending in color for a vivid effect. The film was shot at Ziv Studios. According to Herman Cohen in the book Attack of the Monster Makers by Tom Weaver, the alligator they used for the movie had also been used to dispose of the bodies of the victims of serial killer Joe Ball from a small town outside San Antonio.
Isn't it unusual for a serial killer to not have a middle name?
I guess he had an alligator, so that was his thing.
I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was officially released on November 23rd, 1957, on a double bill with Blood of Dracula in many cities.
Box Office Magazine recommended that theater owners set up a display of surgical instruments in the lobby and publicize them as those used by Professor Frankenstein in constructing the monster. It then add more effect by placing simulated bloodstains on the instruments. And offer a badge of courage, printed by your local printer, to all persons sitting through this terror picture, the badge declaring them to have steel nerves and strong heart.
Taglines for I Was a Teenage Frankenstein include the body of a boy, the mind of a monster, and the soul of an unearthly thing.
And caution, the most gruesome horror ever shown, not for the squeamish, free first aid and smelling salts, don't come in before dinner, warning for people who faint easily, see Frankenstein's monster in color.
The tagline for the double bill read, Warning, can you take it? Fiendish, frenzied, frightening. It will haunt you for days afterwards.
And as Arkoff said in his autobiography, AIP never left a single cliche untouched.
The film did make censors squeamish, though. Director Herbert L. Strock said, We did a scene where Whit Bissell cuts off a leg with an electric saw. You don't actually see it. You hear the sound of a blade cutting through the bone, and then he picks up this phony leg and holds it in front of the camera with blood all over it. The censor said, You can't show him cutting off a leg on camera. You'll have to cut the scene. I argued that it took place off camera, but they insisted they saw him cut into the leg, and I had to run the film for them again.
I guess you got to say I told you so at that point. Reviewing the movie, film critic Richard W. Nason of the New York Times said, If you discount any immediate connection between the mass media and the temper of the culture, then the film warrants little attention. The automaton, enacted by Gary Conway, is a teenager assembled from the limbs of other teenagers. This is in one sense abhorrent. It forces one to acknowledge the impression that such films may aggravate the mass social sickness euphemistically termed juvenile delinquency. In this particular film, there are graphic displays of human dismemberment. Before one such act of surgical perversion, the mad doctor's assistant says, I have no stomach for it. That would be a plausible reaction for any adult who has read the day's headlines about teenage crime.
Box Office said, Teamed with Blood of Dracula, this is the stronger entry of the combo in the purveying of spinal tingles, in the production values, story, and performances. Such results are only natural inasmuch as Cohen allocated a larger sum to its fabrication, even unto the employment of color to accent the super-sanguinary climatic sequences. True to the screenplay, it defies all semblances of believability, but that can hardly be deemed a liability because the shopper for horror certainly do not expect their purchases to be accompanied by logic.
And that's a good thing. Whit Bissell said of his own movie, It wasn't very good, really. It was done in a hurry, which is pretty obvious if you see it. If you're an actor, you take the part and you're glad to get it. It's nice to be working. You've done it, and you can't very well say you didn't do it. You're caught with your pants down, so to speak.
Time magazine predicted, as a sequel to I Was a Teenage Werewolf, I Was a Teenage Frankenstein will probably rank as one of the year's biggest horrors. James Powers of The Hollywood Reporter called it intelligently and imaginatively done.
And I guess somebody went to go see it because I Was a Teenage Frankenstein made $310,000 in its initial release.
The censored British version was released under the shortened title Teenage Frankenstein.
Both I Was a Teenage Werewolf and I Was a Teenage Frankenstein later received a sort of sequel in the crossover How to Make a Monster, released in July of 1958, and Gary Conway starred as the creature in that movie too.
In the bonus features of the Screen Factory release of How to Make a Monster, there is a convention Q&A featuring Gary Conway and Gary Clark, who portrayed the werewolf in How to Make a Monster. And in it, Gary Conway relates a story of how he decided upon a screen name when he was cast for I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, because he was a little embarrassed that his college classmates may see it. He then goes on to tell of how a nearby theater had lines down the street when the marquee read I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, so he was bound to be recognized anyway.
We were at that convention. We saw, right?
Yeah, we were actually at the convention that Q&A took place.
It was called Monster Bash. It's really fun. You should go.
Outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Of course, we've seen some of these players in other movies before. Whit Bissell, who was Professor Frankenstein here, previously appeared in I Was a Teenage Werewolf, 1957, in sort of the same role as the evil doctor who's coaxing the monster out of a teenager.
Phyllis Coates, who portrayed Margaret, had previously appeared in Girls in Prison in 1956.
Gary Conway, or Teenage Creation / Bob, would go on to appear in the Saga of the Viking Women and their voyage to the waters of the Great Sea Serpent, 1957. And of course, he was in How to Make a Monster, as we mentioned earlier, in 1958.
Marshall Bradford, who portrayed Dr. Randolph, who was one of the assembled doctors at the conference in the beginning of the film, had previously appeared in The Fast and the Furious in 1954, It Conquered the World in 1956, and he would later appear in Teenage Caveman in 1958. So, Cheryl, using our AIP scale, where A is awesome, I is intermediate, and P is pathetic, how do you rate I Was a Teenage Frankenstein?
Well, given the title, I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, a viewer would think that the protagonist was the teenager turned into a monster. But instead, the movie is really, I Was a Middle-Aged Dr. Frankenstein, because it's all about the monomaniacal Professor Frankenstein and his obsession with creating a human being out of the spare parts of corpses. The teenage Frankenstein never even had his own name. He remembered almost nothing of his past life. He didn't remember his loved ones, his friends. So to us, he's just a blank canvas, just as he is to the evil Frankenstein. In fact, there are only 2 or 3 teenagers in this movie, and only one of them has anything to do besides being menaced or murdered by a monster. So instead, we get 70-odd minutes of this self-aggrandizing windbag Professor Frankenstein. He takes up all the oxygen in the room, incessantly talking about himself and his plans. He can only speak to others about the ways that he'll be using them. He asks his nurse to marry him, moves her into his home, and then ignores her or hits her or threatens her, all before finally murdering her via his creation. Leave it to him to outsource the murder of his girlfriend. He even has an alligator in a pit to dispose of the remains of anyone that becomes inconvenient to him. And that's pretty out there even for a psychopath. I guess one serial killer did it, though. Whit Bissell plays the evil doctor well, basically playing the same type of character he did in I Was a Teenage Werewolf, like we just said. But there's just too much of him. In Werewolf, the teenage Tony, played by Michael Landon, was a character that we could sympathize with, even though we couldn't cheer on him murdering his friends, but at least he got to tell his own story. He had his own pain. He didn't want to do what he was doing. Here, Frankenstein's nameless creation has no story to tell. He's just the obedient attack dog for his master. Given AIP's mission statement, then, to make movies for teenagers who weren't represented on screen in more mainstream films, this feels like a huge misstep. I imagine many teenagers going to see this in theaters or at the drive-in came away a little disappointed that the movie wasn't really made for them. It's really more of a throwback to the Universal Frankenstein movies. And it doesn't help that this film, written by Herman Cohen, has some rather unpleasant master and servant homoerotic grooming subtext that spills over into the actual text. I think that the idea of the film is good, but everyone involved, rushed as they were to complete this film by a new, earlier deadline, seemed to leave out everything that worked in Teenage Werewolf, like a relatable teenage protagonist who has pals and a sweetheart who get together for some fun in between all the horror scenes. To go back to Teenage Werewolf, it had a scene where the kids have a Halloween party and one of them sings a song, and yeah, that's kind of cheesy, but that's what we like about these early AIP films. This one's just too dark. As a horror film, yeah, it works, and it's scary, but it just doesn't live up to the title. It's not what I was looking for, so I give it an I. What do you think, Jeff?
I agree with a lot of what you said. Due to its title, I have to compare it to I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and I gave that film an I. The things that I did enjoy about that film were entirely lacking in Teenage Frankenstein. It was the stuff that you mentioned. It was the ancillary characters, the other kids, the fun, dancing, singing parties that all acted as a counterpoint to the brooding teenage protagonist. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein takes a totally different approach than I Was a Teenage Werewolf, focusing more on the mad doctor. And this might be to the influence of Hammer's Curse of Frankenstein, as well as the other things we mentioned earlier. Just adding one scene that showed the title character, the teenage Frankenstein, who he was before his death, might have made a huge difference in the way this film plays out. That might not be the story that wants to be told here. And Professor Frankenstein himself certainly didn't know or care anything about this attractive, athletic young man before his accident.
Emphasis on the attractive part.
So perhaps if the audience were privy to the creation's life in the before times, the story might have just been too tragic. The film as it is that is presented to us today might not be worthy of the title I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, due to the fact that Frankenstein is the name of the doctor, not the creation, and it's that old argument. But I think the way the story is told, that Professor Frankenstein is the actual protagonist here, and he's not a teenager. The teenager of the title is the creation, but we don't have a lot of reason to empathize with him because we don't really have a chance to get to know him. I noticed a lot of similarities between Professor Frankenstein here and Dr. Charles Decker in Conga, played by Michael Goff. Both films were written by Herman Cohen, and their attitudes towards science and the women in their life run very parallel to each other. While the latter film may not have quite the amount of homosexual entendre in it, that is probably the only difference between these two characters. And we never get to hear Professor Frankenstein yell, "You fool," when something doesn't go his way. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein has a noticeably lower budget than I Was a Teenage Werewolf, I think. The sets are minimal. There are definitely fewer characters. And the story is a lot simpler. And this may be kind of a controversial opinion, especially when comparing it to I Was a Teenage Werewolf. But I did think this was the stronger of the two movies. Maybe it's because I've just always preferred the story of Frankenstein. But whatever the reason, I'm giving this one an A. I really enjoyed it.
Why? What did you enjoy about it?
I just thought it played really well. I enjoyed the dialogue. I got a kick out of the constant intentional or unintentional homoerotic references and the professor's attitude toward his fiancée.
Oh, dang, that's cold.
I just enjoyed it more than the other one. So it's an A for me.
Well, we'll have to agree to disagree. Would you have liked to see a scene at the party before the accident?
Yeah, that's what
the kid and his friends.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. A scene that showed him just who he was before he died, so we can empathize with him a little more.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder why they didn't think of doing that. Why there was no, maybe his surviving friends could have been looking for him, or his family could have wondered why they didn't have his remains. Maybe
a scene where after the surgery, he has his new face, he's out and about and somebody recognizes him.
Yeah, he could have run into Arlene and she knew him, but he didn't know her. That could have been a really poignant scene.
Right, because the only part of him that she would recognize is his face. The rest is alligator fodder. So I just want to make a note that we did do a comparison of the two cuts of the movie, and we did make a video clip that'll be available on YouTube, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. So you can see for yourself the differences between the American and British cuts of I Was a Teenage Frankenstein.
Yeah, it's a good watch.
And so with that, I think it's time to disassemble and ship off this episode of I Was a Teenage Frankenstein.
Inject the sodium pentothal.
Until next time, I'm Jeff Markin.
And I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And we'll meet you at the drive-in. Follow the American International Podcast on Instagram and Letterboxd at AIP_pod and on Facebook at facebook.com/American International Podcast.
The American International Podcast is produced and edited by Jeff Markin.
A man whose mind is distorted by hatred.
And Cheryl Lightfoot.
A girl hungry for too many things.
The American International Podcast is part of the Pop Culture Entertainment Network.